I drove 6 hours through a blinding Pennsylvania snowstorm with $80,000 in cashier's checks burning a hole in my purse. I thought I was arriving to save my son's marriage. However, standing unseen in their hallway, I heard a single sentence that stopped me cold. I did not hand over the money that night. Instead, I decided to destroy the life they thought they controlled. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. At 58 years old, I have learned that the most dangerous storms are not the ones that rattle the window panes, but the ones that breed inside a quiet house. I sat in my sedan with the engine idling in my driveway. The heater hummed against the encroaching Pennsylvania winter, fighting a losing battle against the chill that seeped through the glass. The weather report predicted 6 hours of treacherous driving between my home in Scranton and my son's house near Pittsburgh. The sky was already a bruised purple color, heavy with snow that threatened to bury the interstate. Most people would have stayed home. Most people would have listened to the warnings about black ice and wind gusts. I was not most people. I was a mother who sensed her family was drifting toward a cliff edge. I looked at the worn leather handbag on the passenger seat. Inside was a white envelope containing 2 cashier's checks, totaling $80,000. It was not money I had stumbled upon or won in a lottery. It was not an inheritance from a wealthy, distant relative. It was 30 years of skipped vacations, bagged lunches, and the life insurance policy my late husband left behind when his heart gave out. It was everything I had. I intended to give it to them for a down payment on a new house. I wanted to buy them stability. I wanted to buy them peace. It's just a rough patch. Mom, Matthew had said on the phone last week, we just need a little help to get over the hump. His voice had sounded thin. It was the sound of a man trying to convince himself as much as me. We had not spoken properly in months. There was a tension that sat between us like a physical weight whenever I called. I blamed the distance. I blamed the stress of his job. I blamed myself for being an overbearing Irish mother who perhaps called too often. But deep down, I knew those were excuses. People often mistook me for a simple retiree who baked cookies and knitted scarves. They saw the grey in my hair and the sensible shoes and assumed I was soft. They did not know about my 20 years at the North River Civic Review Board. I spent 2 decades reading transcripts of police misconduct hearings and civil disputes. I was the woman in the back of the room who organized the files and kept the records. I learned how to spot a lie in a typed transcript. I learned that the system does not protect the innocent. It protects those who know how to manipulate the paperwork. I knew how the machinery of justice ground people down. I knew how to listen to what was not being said. You're doing the right thing. Elle. I whispered to the empty car. They just need a fresh start. I put the car in drive. The windshield wipers slashed back and forth, fighting the first wave of sleet. The road ahead was grey and indistinct. I felt a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with the storm. It was a familiar sensation from my days at the board. It was the feeling I got right before a case fell apart. It was the intuition that told me the story I was being told was not the whole truth. The wipers beat a frantic rhythm as I pulled onto the highway. $80,000 was a lot of money to pay for a lie, but I was willing to pay it if it meant my son was happy. I just prayed I was driving toward a solution and not a disaster. The rhythmic thumping of the tires against the asphalt sent my mind drifting back to the beginning. Matthew was not just my son. After his father died, he became the anchor that held my life in place. He was the boy who mowed the neighbors' lawns for free, and the young man who called me every Sunday without fail. He was charming and ambitious. the kind of man who could sell ice to a polar bear and make the bear thank him for the privilege. I was so proud of him. I wanted him to have the happiness that his father and I had shared, even if our time had been cut short. I remembered the first time he brought Olivia home 3 years ago. She was a striking woman with intelligent eyes and a soft, hesitant smile. She worked as a graphic designer and had a portfolio that could take your breath away. Yet, from that very first dinner, I noticed a certain tightness in her shoulders. She sat on the edge of our plush sofa as if she were waiting for a signal to flee. At the time, I chalked it up to nerves. Meeting the mother of your boyfriend is never easy, and I knew I could be intimidating with my direct questions and my years spent analyzing testimony. However, as the months turned into years, the awkwardness did not fade. It calcified. Our family dinners, which should have been filled with laughter and debate, were often punctuated by silences that felt heavy enough to bruise. I started to notice a pattern that I tried very hard to ignore. Olivia spoke less and less whenever Matthew was in the room. When she did speak, her eyes would dart to him first, checking the weather before she stepped outside. I recalled a Sunday afternoon last spring. We were sitting on my patio, and I had asked Olivia about a promotion she had been excited about weeks prior. So, Liv, did you hear back about the senior designer position? I asked, pouring iced tea. You seemed so perfect for it. Before Olivia could open her mouth, Matthew answered. He did not shout. He did not sound angry. He sounded like a loving, protective husband. She decided against it. Mom, Matthew said, reaching over to squeeze Olivia's hand. We talked about it. And it's just too much pressure right now. We want to focus on the house. I looked at Olivia. She was staring at her lap, her fingers twisting a loose thread on her jeans. Is that right, Olivia? I asked gently. She looked up, but not at me. She looked at him. I think Matthew is right, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It would be too much. See, she knows her limits, Matthew said with a chuckle, patting her hand as if she were a child who had almost touched a hot stove. Besides, I make enough for both of us. She doesn't need the stress. It was those small moments that pricked at my conscience. There were times when we were out at a restaurant, and Olivia would ask for the check, then immediately apologize when Matthew frowned. There were moments when she would decline a glass of wine because Matthew made a joke about her being a lightweight, even though I had seen her enjoy a glass with me when he was not around. She asked for permission for things that grown women usually just did. Do you mind if I use the restroom before we leave? She would ask him. Make it quick, babe. He would reply, checking his watch. We're on a schedule. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I told myself that every marriage had its own rhythm and its own private language. Maybe Olivia liked having a dominant partner. Maybe Matthew was just being old-fashioned and protective, trying to shield her from the harshness of the corporate world. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that my son was the hero of the story, not the villain. But the training from the North River Civic Review Board never really leaves you. Deep down, a small voice in the back of my head was whispering that protection should not feel like containment. I pushed the thought away. I blamed my own cynical nature. I convinced myself that with a new house and $80,000 to clear their debts, the stress would evaporate, and the confident, artistic woman I caught glimpses of would finally emerge. I was driving into the storm to save them. but I was beginning to fear that the cracks in the foundation went far deeper than money could fix. The decision to drive into the teeth of a blizzard was not impulsive. It began with a phone call from Matthew 2 days prior. His voice had been tight, lacking its usual bravado, and for the first time in years, he sounded like the little boy who used to hide behind my legs when strangers came to the door. "Mum, things are tough right now," he had admitted, his voice cracking slightly over the line. "I think you should come visit. We need some stability. Maybe if you're here, Olivia will calm down." That request was all the permission I needed. I went to the bank the very next morning. I liquidated my savings accounts and the remainder of the life insurance payout. $80,000. It was a staggering sum for a woman who clipped coupons for laundry detergent, but I viewed it as a necessary investment. I told myself this money would be the down payment on the colonial house they had been eyeing in the suburbs. It was a bribe to the universe to keep my son's marriage intact. I packed the envelope with the cashier's checks deep inside my purse. Alongside the money, I packed a vintage cast-iron skillet that had belonged to my grandmother and a quilt I had spent 6 months stitching by hand. Every stitch was a silent prayer for their happiness, a tangible offering of warmth to thaw whatever frost had settled between them. Now, 3 hours into the drive, the Pennsylvania landscape had vanished behind a curtain of white. The snow was coming down in sheets, horizontal and angry. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel as the sedan shuddered against the wind. The rhythmic slap of the wipers was the only sound keeping me tethered to reality. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I glanced down quickly, risking a second of distraction. It was a text from Olivia. "Drive safe. See you soon." It was polite. It was correct. It was completely devoid of warmth. There were no exclamation points, no emojis, none of the casual intimacy she used to show in the early days. I had sent her a message an hour earlier, telling her I was bringing a surprise that would change their lives. Her response felt automated, like a reply generated by a machine rather than a daughter-in-law anticipating a visit. The coldness of the text made my mind wander back to the dusty archives of the North River Civic Review Board. I spent decades reading the transcripts of emergency calls and reviewing officer reports on domestic disturbances. I learned that violence does not always look like a bruise. Sometimes it looks like a woman who stops seeing her friends. Sometimes it looks like a bank account that only the husband can access. Sometimes it looks like a wife who is too polite, too careful, too terrified of making a mistake. I remembered a specific case, file number 294. The husband was a pillar of the community, a deacon at his church. The wife was quiet. Everyone thought they were the perfect couple until the police arrived one night. I remembered reading her statement later. She spoke about how he never hit her, but he managed every minute of her day until she felt like a ghost in her own life. She described the isolation as a slow suffocation. I shook my head violently, forcing my eyes back to the treacherous road. "Stop it." "Eleanor," I said aloud, my voice sounding small in the cabin. You are imagining things." I was projecting my professional cynicism onto my own flesh and blood. Matthew was not a monster. He was the boy who cried when his goldfish died. He was the man who called me to fix his tire when he was 22 because he did not want to get his suit dirty. He was stressed. They were both stressed. That was all. Yet, the unease in my gut churned harder than the storm outside. The windshield wipers slashed back and forth, like a judge's gavel banging for order. But I could not silence the questions rising in my throat. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal, eager to reach them, eager to prove myself wrong, eager to hand over the $80,000 and wash away the tension with money. I did not know that I was driving straight into a revelation that would make the storm outside look like a gentle breeze. I pulled into the driveway just past 4 in the afternoon. The storm had actually worked in my favor in a strange way, clearing the usually congested interstate as lesser drivers pulled off to wait out the squall. I had driven with a singular, white-knuckled focus, arriving an hour earlier than I had told Matthew. The house stood dark against the swirling grey sky, save for a warm yellow glow spilling from the kitchen window. It looked idyllic, a picture-perfect suburban sanctuary nestled in the snow. I grabbed my heavy purse, the one containing $80,000 in checks, and made a dash for the front porch. The wind bit at my exposed cheeks. I did not ring the doorbell. I had a spare key they had given me years ago for emergencies, and I wanted to get out of the biting cold immediately. I slid the key into the lock, turned it silently, and stepped into the foyer. The house was unnervingly quiet. There was no music playing, no television humming in the background, not even the sound of the heating system kicking on. I stamped the snow off my boots on the rug, preparing to call out a cheerful greeting. I opened my mouth, but the sound of my son's voice froze the words in my throat. I asked you a simple question. Olivia. His voice was coming from the kitchen. It was not loud. It was not the booming shout of a man who had lost his temper. It was low, smooth, and terrifyingly calm. It was a tone I recognized from the transcripts of interrogations I used to file the voice of a man who knows he holds all the cards. I took a step closer to the hallway that led to the kitchen, my boots silent on the hardwood. I intended to announce myself, to break the tension, but curiosity anchored my feet to the floor. I told you, Matt, Olivia's voice replied. It was so soft I had to strain to hear it. It sounded wet, as if she were fighting back tears. I went to the bakery you like, but they were closed due to the weather. This was the only place open, so you compromised. Matthew said. I could hear the sneer in his pronunciation. You decided that because it was inconvenient for you. My mother deserves second best. Is that it? No, of course not. Olivia stammered. I just thought. Having a cake was better than nothing. You thought? Matthew repeated, and the venom in those 2 words made my stomach turn. That is the problem, isn't it? You try to think, and you make a mess of it. Look at this icing. It looks cheap. It looks like something you'd pick up at a gas station. There was a heavy pause. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, clutching my purse against my chest. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was not a bicker about groceries. This was something else entirely. I'm sorry, Olivia whispered. I can try to fix it. Don't touch it. Matthew snapped. The sudden sharpness in his voice made me jump. You'll just make it worse. You ruin everything you touch. Olivia, you know that. I stopped breathing. The air in the hallway felt suddenly thin. I waited for him to laugh, to say he was joking, to break the tension with the charm I knew he possessed. But there was only silence, followed by the sound of silverware being forcefully arranged on a table. Then Matthew spoke again, delivering the sentence that shattered every illusion I held about my son. Honestly, I don't know why I bother trying to teach you standards, he said, his voice dripping with a cold, casual cruelty. Without me to guide you, you would be nothing but a helpless child wandering in the dark. I felt a physical blow to my chest. This was not a bad mood. This was not stress. This was a systematic dismantling of another human being. I stood there, invisible in his house, holding a fortune intended to reward this behavior. And I felt the bile rise in my throat. I had walked in expecting to find a rough patch. Instead, I had found a prison. I stood rooted to the hardwood floor. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Yet my mind was strangely, icily calm. It was a sensation I had not felt since my days reviewing the worst case files at the North River Civic Review Board. It was the moment the chaotic pieces of a puzzle suddenly snapped into a horrific, recognizable picture. I was no longer a mother visiting her son. I was a witness observing a crime scene where no blood had yet been spilled. I recognized the tone. I recognized the vocabulary. I had read it in hundreds of transcripts where victims described the slow erosion of their personhood. This was not a bad mood or a marital spat. This was coercive control. It was a systematic breaking of the spirit. I realized with a sick lurch in my stomach that Olivia was not weak. She was not antisocial or cold. She was surviving. She was a woman walking through a minefield in her own kitchen, trying desperately not to trigger an explosion. I leaned forward just enough to catch a glimpse of them through the sliver of space between the doorframe and the wall. Olivia stood by the granite island. Her posture was painful to witness. Her shoulders were hunched up toward her ears, a physical manifestation of a flinch waiting to happen. She stared at the floor tiles as if her life depended on counting the specks of dust there. She looked like a prisoner of war in a luxury cell. I'll throw it out. Matt, Olivia said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to embarrass you. It's not about embarrassment. Olivia? Matthew replied, turning his back to her to open the refrigerator. It's about competence. My hand hovered over the door handle. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to burst into that room. I wanted to march in there and slap the arrogance off my son's face. I wanted to grab Olivia and pull her out of that house. But the part of me that knew how the system worked forced me to freeze. If I walked in there now, Matthew would pivot instantly. He was smart. He was charming. He would laugh it off. He would say, "Oh, Mom, you're overreacting. We were just joking around." He would turn to Olivia, and with one look, he would force her to agree with him. She would nod, terrified, and I would look like the hysterical, intrusive mother. I would lose any leverage I had before the game even started. I had to be smarter than him. I had to be strategic. Slowly, agonizingly. I backed away. I retraced my steps through the foyer, careful to keep my boots from squeaking on the floor. I slipped back out the front door and pulled it shut with a soft click that was lost in the howling wind. I practically ran back to my car, my breath coming in short. Sharp gasps. I threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the doors, as if the toxicity inside the house could chase me out here. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the relentless snow. I turned to look at the passenger seat. The worn leather handbag sat there, heavy with the weight of $80,000 in cashier's checks. An hour ago, that money was a symbol of hope. It was meant to be a foundation for their future. Now, in the grey light of the storm, it looked hideous. It looked like a set of golden handcuffs. I realized with terrifying clarity that if I gave them that money now, I would not be saving their marriage. I would be funding Olivia's captivity. I would be buying a bigger, nicer house for Matthew to control her in. The money would tie her to him even tighter, making it impossible for her to leave. No, I whispered to the dashboard. Not a penny. I was not going into that house yet. Not until I had a plan. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking not from the cold, but from a rage that burned hotter than any fire. I needed to compose myself. I needed to become Eleanor Whitmore of the review board again. I watched the snow pile up on the hood of the car, burying the warmth of the engine, and I waited. The mother in me was weeping, but the strategist in me was sharpening her knives. I stood on the windswept porch and pressed the doorbell, counting the seconds. I needed to play the role of the tired, oblivious mother perfectly. If Matthew suspected for 1 second that I had heard him, the walls would go up, and I would lose my chance to extract Olivia. The door swung open. Matthew stood there, forcing a wide, brittle smile onto his face. His eyes were darting around, still manic from the argument I had witnessed from the shadows only minutes before. "Mum," he exclaimed, his voice a little too loud, a little too enthusiastic. "You're here? We weren't expecting you for another hour." I slumped my shoulders intentionally, feigning a fatigue that was only half-acted. The drive was a nightmare. "Matthew," I said, letting my voice waver. I can barely keep my eyes open. "I just wanted to let you know I made it. But I think I need to check into that motel down the road before I can be good company. I'm afraid I'd just fall asleep on your couch if I came in now." The tension drained out of his body so fast it was almost visible. He exhaled a long breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. He looked at my man who had just been granted a stay of execution. "Oh," he said, and then a genuine smile broke through. "Oh, really, I mean. Yeah, that is probably for the best. Mum, the roads are brutal. You should rest. We want you at 100%, behind him." Olivia appeared in the hallway. She looked small. Her eyes were red-rimmed. But when she heard I was not coming in, she closed her eyes briefly. It was not disappointment. It was profound gratitude. She needed time to put her armor back on. "Drive safe, Eleanor," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. We'll make a nice breakfast tomorrow." "I will," I promised. "I just need a little time." I walked back to my car, feeling their eyes on my back. As soon as I closed the driver's side door and pulled out of the driveway, the act dropped. I drove 2 blocks down to a gas station parking lot that was empty except for a snowplow. I killed the engine and sat in the dark. I did not go to the motel. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I scrolled past the family contacts and found the folder I had not opened since my retirement. I dialed a number that belonged to Sarah, a records clerk at the county courthouse who owed me a favor from a messy custody case 5 years ago. Eleanor Sarah answered on the 3rd ring, her voice surprised. "Is everything okay? It's 8 o'clock on a Friday. I need you to look something up for me." "Sarah," I said, skipping the pleasantries, "I need you to check the deed and the lien status on my son's house, Matthew Whitmore, and check if there are any civil filings under his name in the last 2 years. Eleanor, I can't just—" "Please," I interrupted. "It is important. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't." There was a pause, and then I heard the familiar clicking of a keyboard. I waited, watching the snow bury the world outside. "Okay," Sarah said after a minute. "The house is solely in his name. That's odd for a married couple, isn't it? And, Eleanor, there are 3 different civil disputes here. He sued a contractor last year for breach of implied warranty over a deck repair. He sued a neighbour over a property line dispute 2 years ago. And there is a small claims case against a former employer. He is litigious, I whispered. He uses the law to bully people. It looks like he settles just before court every time. Sarah noted. He drags it out, drains their money, and then accepts a settlement. Eleanor, are you in trouble? No, I said, my grip tightening on the phone. I am just doing my due diligence. Thank you. Sarah. I hung up. The pieces were clicking together with a terrifying precision. The control I had heard in the kitchen was not an anomaly. It was his personality. He controlled the house title to keep Olivia insecure. He used lawsuits to intimidate outsiders. He was a man who needed to win every single interaction, no matter the cost. I looked at the $80,000 in checks sitting on the passenger seat. If I gave him this money, he would not pay off the house. He would take it, hide it in an account only he controlled, and use it as another weapon to keep Olivia dependent. You are not getting a dime. Matthew, I said to the silence of the car. I started the engine. I was not going to the motel to sleep. I was going back to that house. But this time, I was not going as a mother bearing gifts. I was going as an investigator returning to the scene of the crime. And I was going to wait for him to make a mistake. I pulled the sedan back into the driveway less than 20 minutes after I had left. The storm had intensified, turning the world into a swirling vortex of white, which gave me the perfect cover for my return. I did not need to act much. The wind was strong enough to push a grown man over, and the cold was biting. When Matthew opened the door, his smile was tighter this time, the corners of his mouth straining against the annoyance bubbling underneath. Roads are closed. Matthew, I said, stomping the snow off my boots. A truck jackknifed 2 miles down near the exit ramp. The police are turning everyone back. I am afraid you are stuck with me for the night. Of course. Mom? Matthew said, though his eyes did not smile. He looked over my shoulder at the wall of snow. We can make up the guest room. It's mostly storage right now. But it's warm. I don't mind. I replied, unbuttoning my coat. I just need a glass of water and a place to lay my head. I'm feeling very old tonight. I saw his shoulders relax. He liked that. He liked the idea of me being frail and dependent. It fit the narrative he had constructed where he was the strong, benevolent patriarch taking care of the weak women in his life. I'll go move some boxes, he said. Liv is in the kitchen. Get some water. He went upstairs, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. I waited until he was out of sight before I moved toward the kitchen. Olivia was standing by the sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, washing a plate that I suspected was already clean. She jumped when I entered, water splashing onto the granite. Oh, Eleanor, she breathed, clutching her chest. You startled me. I'm sorry. Olivia? I said, keeping my voice low. I walked over to the refrigerator and poured myself a glass of water from the dispenser. I took a sip, watching her profile. She looked exhausted, her skin pale and drawn tight over her cheekbones. He is hard on you, I said. It was not a question. Olivia froze. Her hands stopped moving in the water. She did not look at me. She stared out the window into the blackness of the storm. He wants perfection, she whispered. Perfection is a myth, I said, stepping closer. And it is a heavy burden to carry alone. I have money. Olivia, I brought $80,000. I was going to give it to him for the house, but I can give it to you. If you need to go." Olivia turned her head slowly. Her eyes were wide with terror. She looked at the ceiling, checking for unseen ears, before she leaned in close to me. "Money doesn't matter. Eleanor," she said, her voice shaking so hard it was barely audible. He calls my office 3 times a day, and if I don't answer on the first ring, he comes to the parking lot to check if my car is there." The sentence hung in the air between us like a guillotine blade. That was not just jealousy. That was surveillance. That was the behavior of a stalker who had convinced his victim to marry him. Before I could respond, the floorboards in the hallway creaked. "Everything okay in here?" Matthew stood in the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, his arms crossed over his chest. He was smiling, but his eyes were flat and dead. He looked from Olivia to me, assessing the distance between us, calculating what might have been said in the 30 seconds he was gone. "Just catching up." "Matt," I said, forcing my voice to sound light and airy. I was telling Olivia how much I admire her keeping this kitchen so spotless. I never had the patience for it. Matthew chuckled, a low sound that did not reach his throat. He walked over to Olivia and placed a hand on the back of her neck. It looked like a caress. But I saw Olivia's spine stiffen. I saw her knuckles turn white as she gripped the edge of the sink. His fingers squeezed, just slightly, a gesture of ownership rather than affection. "She tries," Matthew said, looking at me with a patronizing expression. "She needs a lot of direction, but she tries. Don't you, babe?" "Yes," Olivia whispered. "I try." "Mom, you should get some sleep," Matthew said, turning his attention back to me. "You're talking nonsense. You look like you're about to collapse. Let's get you to bed before you start imagining things." He dismissed me. He looked at my grey hair, my sensible sweater, and my tired face. And he saw nothing but a harmless old woman. He thought I was past my prime. He thought I was too feeble to understand the game he was playing. He thought his control was absolute. I set my glass down on the counter. "You are right. Matthew," I said, smiling a sweet, confused, grandmotherly smile. "I am just so tired. My mind isn't what it used to be." I walked past them, heading for the stairs. As I climbed, I felt a cold resolve harden in my chest. He had made the classic mistake of every tyrant I had ever studied in my 20 years at the board. He had underestimated the person observing him. He thought he had won. He did not know that while he was tightening his grip on Olivia, I was mentally drafting the strategy that would cut off his hands. I was not going to sleep. I was going to war. The storm outside was rattling the window panes of the dining room, but the atmosphere inside was far more volatile. We sat around the mahogany table with a dinner of reheated takeout that no one was really eating. I had placed the thick white envelope containing $80,000 in the center of the table, right between the salt shaker and the pepper mill. It sat there like a loaded gun. Matthew could not take his eyes off it. Every time he took a bite of his food, his gaze drifted back to that paper rectangle. He was salivating, not for the meal, but for the control that money represented. He thought he had already won. He thought I was just a lonely widow desperate to buy her way back into her son's life. "So," Matthew said, wiping his mouth with a napkin and leaning back in his chair with an air of relaxed authority. "We really appreciate this. Mom, it's going to make a huge difference for us. We can finally get ahead of the bills. Before you take it." "Matthew," I said, resting my hand gently over the envelope. I want to have a frank conversation. If I am investing in this family, I need to understand the structure of the investment. Matthew chuckled, a condescending sound that grated against my nerves. He glanced at Olivia, who was staring at her plate, pushing a piece of broccoli around with her fork. It's not a business merger. Mom, he said, his voice dripping with patience. It's just family helping family. But shoot. Ask whatever you want. I want to talk about the house title, I said calmly. The air in the room changed instantly. Matthew's smile didn't disappear, but it froze in place. What about it, he asked. Well, I continued, keeping my tone light and conversational. If this money is for a down payment on a new place, or to pay off debts on this one, I assume Olivia's name will be on the deed, since marriage is a partnership. Olivia isn't good with that kind of paperwork, Matthew said quickly, waving his hand dismissively. It stresses her out. I handle the assets to protect her. Right, babe. He looked at Olivia. Usually, this was her cue to nod and agree, but she didn't. She kept her eyes on her plate, her hand gripping her fork so tightly her knuckles were white. That is interesting, I said, leaning forward. Because when I called the county clerk's office about an hour ago, they told me this house is solely in your name. They also mentioned 3 civil lawsuits you filed in the last 2 years. One against a neighbor, one against a contractor, and one against a former employer. Matthew's face went a shade of red that clashed with the dark room. He slammed his fork down. You called the clerk? He stammered, his voice rising. Why would you do that, due diligence? I replied, my voice turning into the steel trap I used to use during hearings. You told me you were struggling because of the economy, but the public record suggests you are struggling because you burn bridges and sue anyone who disagrees with you. You drain your own resources fighting battles that don't exist. You don't know what you're talking about. Matthew snapped. The charm was gone now. The predator was surfacing. I am protecting this family. I am the one who deals with the contractors who try to rip us off. I am the one who deals with the neighbors who encroach on our property lines. Olivia can't handle that. She's too soft. She is not soft. Matthew, I said, looking directly into his eyes. She is silenced. There is a difference. And this money, it doesn't go to a man who uses the law as a weapon to isolate his wife. Matthew stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. He loomed over the table, using his height to intimidate, a tactic that might have worked on Olivia. But I had stared down corrupt police captains and angry union reps for 2 decades. I did not blink. You are a guest in my house, Matthew hissed. You don't get to come in here and judge how I run my marriage based on some phone call you made from your car. He turned his glare on Olivia, expecting her to rush to his defense, to soothe him, to apologize for the chaos his mother was causing. Tell her. Olivia, Matthew commanded, tell her to stop this nonsense. The room went silent. The wind howled outside. Olivia slowly lifted her head. She looked at Matthew. And for the first time in years, there was no fear in her eyes. There was only exhaustion and a spark of something new. Olivia started, her voice shaking. Speak up, Matthew barked. Olivia took a deep breath. She looked at me, then back at him. I won't, she said. It was 2 words. Just 2 words. But they hit Matthew harder than a physical blow. He looked as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He blinked, confused. waiting for the apology that always followed. It did not come. Olivia sat still, her chin slightly raised, refusing to retreat. I pulled the envelope of money off the table and slipped it back into my purse. The sound of the zipper closing was the loudest thing in the room. The power had shifted. Matthew was no longer the warden. He was just a man who had overplayed his hand. And he was beginning to realize that the women at the table were no longer playing by his rules. The wind shrieked against the siding of the house, a high-pitched wail that sounded like a warning siren. Inside the dining room, the silence was absolute. Matthew stood by the head of the table, his chest heaving, his face a mask of fractured ego. He looked at me, then at Olivia, trying to regain his footing on ground that was rapidly turning into quicksand. "Matthew," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "I need you to step into the living room. I need 5 minutes with Olivia alone. This is my house." He spat, his eyes narrowing. "You don't give orders here. If you want even a chance of seeing a penny of that $80,000, I said, tapping the clasp of my purse, "you will give us 5 minutes. Go." He hesitated. I saw the greed warring with his pride. Greed won, as I knew it would. He turned on his heel and stalked out of the room, slamming the double doors behind him. The vibration rattled the crystal in the china cabinet. I turned to Olivia. She was trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were colourless. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights, waiting for the impact. "Olivia, look at me," I commanded softly. She raised her eyes. They were wide and wet with unshed tears. "I am not here to tell you what to do," I said, keeping my voice steady and low. "But I know what I saw today. I know what I heard. You are not living here. You are surviving here. And I know that survival has a shelf life. I don't know where to go," she whispered, the words barely escaping her throat. "He checks the mileage on the car. He tracks my phone. I can't. I have $80,000 in this bag." I interrupted. "I intended it for a house, but a house is just a cage if you don't have the key. This money can be a down payment, or it can be a getaway fund. It can be a lawyer. It can be a new apartment in a city where he cannot find you." I reached across the table and covered her cold hand with mine. "The car is leaving in 10 minutes, I said. "I am driving back into the storm. You can stay here and shrink until there is nothing left of you. Or you can get in that car. It is your choice. No pressure. But if you stay, the money leaves with me." Olivia looked at the closed doors where her husband waited. Then she looked at the dark window where the snow was burying the world, for a long, agonizing minute. She did not move. Then, slowly, she pulled her hand from mine. She reached up and unclasped the thin silver necklace Matthew had given her, the one she always fiddled with nervously. She laid it on the placemat. It was a small, silent surrender of his claim on her. She nodded once. It was not a vigorous nod, but it was final. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened the message draft I had prepared while sitting in the dark of the gas station parking lot. It was addressed to my contact at the bank, a personal friend who managed the transfers. The message was a simple instruction to void the current cashier's checks and prepare a wire transfer to a new account under a different name. My maiden name, which I could legally use to shelter funds for a dependent. I hit send. The screen flashed, delivered. The $80,000 was effectively gone from this table, vanished into the ether of the banking system, inaccessible to anyone but me. The double doors swung open. Matthew strode back in, his patience exhausted. He looked from me to Olivia, expecting to see a resolved situation. He expected to see his wife docile and the check on the table. Instead, he saw the empty table. He saw the bare wood where the envelope had been. "Where is it?" he asked. His voice was not loud, but it trembled with a sudden, dawning panic. "It is gone?" "Matthew," I said, standing up and slinging my purse over my shoulder. "What do you mean?" "Gone?" he demanded, stepping closer. "You said—" "I said I would invest in this family," I replied, moving to stand beside Olivia. "I just decided to change the portfolio." He looked at Olivia. He saw the necklace on the table. He saw her standing upright, not cowering. For the first time, he realized that the atmosphere in the room had shifted irrevocably. He was no longer the tallest man in the room. He was just a man, alone in a storm. "Olivia," he said. And for the first time, I heard a note of genuine fear in his voice. "Liv, what are you doing?" "She is getting her coat," I answered for her. The wind outside battered the house with renewed fury, shaking the very foundations. But the look on Matthew's face told me the real storm was standing right in front of him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The panic was setting in, cold and sharp. He realized he had lost control, and for a man like him, that was a fate worse than death. The atmosphere in the room shattered. Matthew lunged toward the hallway, his face twisted into a mask of ugly desperation. He blocked the archway with his body, spreading his arms wide as if he could physically wall us in. You can't just take my wife," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me and Olivia. "This is kidnapping. I'll call the police. I'll tell them you're forcing her." I stepped forward. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout. I simply projected the cold, bureaucratic authority I had honed over 20 years of watching liars try to talk their way out of consequences. "Go ahead, Matthew," I said softly. "Call them. But before you dial, you should remember that I know the sheriff in this county. I used to process his paperwork. And I know about the civil suit you filed against your neighbor for looking at your fence the wrong way. I know about the contractor you sued because you didn't want to pay the final invoice. I know your pattern." Matthew froze. His arms lowered slightly. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking gray and sickly. "If the police come here tonight," I continued, taking another step closer, forcing him to retreat, "they will not see a kidnapping. They will see a woman leaving a coercive environment. And if you try to stop her physically, I will ensure that domestic assault and false imprisonment are added to your already colorful legal history. Do you really want to go to court against your own mother?" He looked at me, and for the first time, he saw the predator behind the grandmotherly facade. He realized that the $80,000 was never a gift. It was a test, and he had failed it spectacularly. Olivia walked into the hallway. She was wearing her heavy winter coat and clutching a small overnight bag she had apparently kept packed in the back of the closet. A detail that broke my heart and hardened my resolve simultaneously. She stopped in front of her husband. She did not look down. She did not flinch. I am done. Matt," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not waver. "I am done being managed. Liv, baby, please." Matthew whispered, trying one last time to use the charm that had trapped her. It's just stress. We can fix this. Think about the house. Think about the money Mom brought. The money is gone. Matthew, I said, cutting him off. And so is she. I placed a hand on Olivia's back, guiding her past him. He made a small, pathetic movement as if to grab her arm, but I fixed him with a stare so withering that he recoiled. We walked out the front door and into the biting wind. The snow was falling in heavy, blinding sheets, but the air felt cleaner than the stifling atmosphere inside that house. We got into my car. I locked the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I looked back at the house. Matthew was standing in the open doorway, oblivious to the cold, watching his control drive away. He looked small. He looked insignificant. He was a man who had built a kingdom on sand, and the tide had finally come in. I did not leave him the $80,000. I did not leave him a note. I left him with the silence of an empty house and the crushing weight of his own ego. As I turned onto the unploughed road, the headlights cutting through the darkness, I reached over and patted Olivia's hand. She was crying, but they were tears of release, not sorrow. I drove 6 hours through a storm to save a family, and I did. I just didn't save the one Matthew thought I would. Justice does not always come with a gavel and a judge. Sometimes, it comes in the form of a mother who knows exactly when to close the checkbook and open the car door. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this one and want to hear more, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button to support the channel, and smash the hype button so this story can reach even more people. Stay safe out there.